We are continuing our study on the book of Revelation. We've gone through about 85 weeks on Sunday night. Hi. On Sunday night, we've been going through somewhere about 85 weeks. Now, I heard somebody tell about one preacher and said he was teaching on Revelation and he taught the best he could till he got to chapter 4, and he said, "This is just too hard. I'm going to go do something else." Well, we've covered chapter 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and so forth. And we've covered this for these past 85 weeks or so. And as I teach Revelation, sometimes I just want to talk to you. Because when you study this book, it's not at all what people think it is. People will come up to me and they say, "When are you going to talk about the end of time? Book of Revelation." You're going to find, when I'm going to preach about the end of time in the New Testament, it's not this book I go to. It is the Gospels I go to, particularly Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21st chapter. These are the there's more prophecy wrapped up in these chapters right here about the end of time than you're going to, well, I won't say than you're going to find in Revelation. Revelation has the end of time in it along the way, but prophecy about the end of time, these chapters right there, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, of course, you can't teach those chapters unless you understand 1 Samuel through 2 Chronicles, because that's the time period Israel was a nation, and that's the time period that they went after other gods, and that particularly Baal, the grove, Shemash, Moloch or Molech, different ways of spelling it, and Ashtaroth, Ashtoreth, the Ashtoreth, the E is singular, the Ashtaroth is plural with an O, and Ashtart. These are some of the common names of the gods of the Old Testament, and they were all simply sun gods and tree goddesses or moon goddesses. Well, because Israel went after all these things, God scattered them. He sent the sword, the famine, the pestilence, and the beast. And the beast was Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome to carry Israel into captivity. God sent the sword, the famine, the pestilence first, and then when they were so rebellious, it sent the beast to carry them into captivity. And they've been in captivity for 2,600 years since they were carried away in 722 BC. Northern Israel was carried away because of their idolatry and their ignoring the laws of God in 722 by the Assyrians in 586 BC. The southern Judah was carried into captivity because this pagan idolatry of Baal in the grove bled down to southern Judah, and it really took hold in northern Israel in 1 Kings, the 16th chapter, when Ahab married Jezebel, and Jezebel's father was the priest of Ashtart, or the Ashtaroth, and he was also a priest of Baal of Babylon. So when you get into these chapters right here, they tell you all about Israel going after these other gods. And Luke 21:24 says the Jews, the ones who God called in the Old Testament, they'll fall by the edge of the sword. They'll be led away captive into all nations by the beast. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down to the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles ruling Jerusalem is fulfilled. And that happened in the 6-day war of June 5th through June 10th of 1967. Well, that's prophecy right there. And I don't know if you would I wouldn't really call Revelation prophecy as much as I would call it some of it's prophecy, but some of it, the very meaning of the word revelation itself is not so much about prophecy to us, it's about God revealing himself to us. The word revelation is the word apo, A-P-O-K-A-L-U-P-S-I-S. And we say apocalypse, that's the word apocalypsis. And we say apocalypse. Well, it's not some mysterious, spooky, hazy thing. It comes from apo and kalypto. In fact, apocalypto is the word revealed. Revealed. So revealed comes from the word revelation, and it means to remove the cover. And that's what God is doing. But the only people he's removing the cover to is his elect family. Now, if you'll notice, chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Let's read 1 through 4. The revelation of Jesus Christ. We've already said that he reveals himself to whomsoever he will. That's the ones that he reveals himself to. And he only reveals himself to his predestinated elect family. And he has been revealing himself to us since the Garden of Eden. He's been revealing himself to his chosen family. And that's the church, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel. The signification, of course, the word signify is S-E-M-E-I-O-O, and it means to give signs, beacons, flags, and you might say pointers. All these are just pointers pointing us to the truth. That's what a sign or beacon or flag is. And he goes on to say, he's going to signify or send signs by his angel unto his servant John. Now the message is going to be given to John, but John is going to give the message to churches who bear record of the word of God. And remember that word record, marturia. It's the same word as witness. Who witnessed of the word of God and of the testimony. And that word testimony comes from the word record. And both of these words, record and testimony, testimony is the word the word record is usually marturion, M-A-R-T-U-R-I-O-N. Testimony, M-A-R-T-U-R-I-A. And both of those words come from martus, which is the word witness. And we also get the word martyr from that, or mature. You're going to find this each time you see testimony, each time you see record, think of witness. Think of being a martyr and think of a blood baptism. Because a blood baptism, that's what they called a martyrdom in the first century, was a blood baptism. And Jesus, that's exactly what Jesus was talking about when he told James and John, can you be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? And he said, of all things that he saw, blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy. Of course, the word here is the word akouo, A-K-O-U-O. And that word means to understand. Understand or to perceive. Now, why would he say that? And people come up to me and they'll say, oh, I've tried to read Revelation. Boy, I just don't understand that. It means you don't have an ear to hear. Because the Bible says we're supposed to be able to understand this book. But the only way that we found in these last 85 weeks of studying it, the only thing that we found out is we got to define every word in the book, isn't it? We got to go back to the Old Testament and look at the culture of the Jews and their laws. Revelation The book of Revelation is about God revealing himself to the New Testament Israel, which is the Jews of the heart. He revealed himself to Old Testament Israel. Well, he did that this way, like this. This is the tabernacle, and there's the fire. Do you think he's revealing himself with that big fire to all these people? There's just a fire there, and there's no fuel, and there's nothing causing it to burn. It's just hovering. I think he's revealing himself. And didn't he reveal himself to them in the Old Testament whenever he would bring water out of a rock? When they went into the wilderness, and there was probably, it's estimated, 2 to 2.5 million Jews went into the wilderness. And can you imagine? Look here. They came out of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and went into this wilderness. 2.5 million people out here in the wilderness with no food and no water. We're talking about everybody in Nashville and all of the surrounding cities. Well, actually, we're going to need something more than that. It'd be like taking everybody in Dallas, taking everybody that's in Dallas, Texas, and leading them out into a desert where there's no water and no food. Well, did he reveal himself out there in the desert? Yeah, he said there'll be a cloud by day and a fire by night to lead you. And all of a sudden, when night came, poof, here comes this fire. And where'd that come from? That's God. He doesn't need any fuel in order to burn. Well, I think that's revealing himself. He's revealing himself in this book of Revelation. It's a picture of him revealing himself. But he revealed himself to them when he gave them, here they were with no food. He said, I'm going to give you doves in the morning. I'm going to give you manna every morning for 6 straight days. And then on the 6th day, you're going to have to gather enough for the 7th day. But do not gather more than you can eat on Monday evening. On Monday morning, don't gather more than you can eat on Monday because it will rot and be putrefied come Tuesday. I'll give you food for Tuesday come Tuesday morning. We're talking about 2.5 million people. Did he reveal himself to them? I guess so. And when the people at Amalek, as soon as they got out here in the wilderness, the people at Amalek were just south of Israel. They attacked Israel. And Israel didn't have any weapons. They didn't have armies. Did God reveal himself when he overthrew the Amalekites? Did God reveal himself when he opened up this Red Sea and then Pharaoh's armies went in, the most powerful army in the world? That was the strongest people at the time in the world, and he destroyed all of their military might. Yeah, he revealed himself. And did he reveal himself when he said, your shoes will not wear out? You'll walk in the wilderness for 40 years, and you'll start off with one pair of shoes, and you'll have them at the end of 40 years, and they will not be worn. Did he reveal himself when in 120-degree sun, he said, your feet will not swell up and blister and burst? How can that be? He was revealing himself to him. There was a revelation going on over here in the desert. Well, he's talking about revealing himself to the church here because he says here let's read 3. Blessed is he that readeth, and they that understand the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand. John 2, the 7 churches which are in Asia. That's who it's actually written to, and it doesn't mean just to the 7 churches? If it's only to the 7 churches of Asia, why did they write this down and put it in the Bible? Why? If it's only to the 7 churches of Asia. It is a part of the canon of Scripture. It is to the church. And remember, the word 7 is the word Sheba. In the Hebrew, that's the cardinal number 7. And it comes from the very same root as Shabbat. That word Shabbat means to take an oath, or it means to complete, or to seven oneself. Now that word complete has that's equivalent to the Greek word teleos, T-E-L-E-I-O-S, and that is the word perfect. Whenever the Lord says, be ye perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect, it means to be completed. To be completed. And that comes about by the fiery trial. I believe that when he says to the 7 churches, what he's saying is to the complete church, or to the completed church. That is all. And a church is not a building. Church is the word ecclesia, E-K-K-L-E-S-I-A, ecclesia. Comes from kaleo and ek. Ek means out. Kaleo means to call. We've been called out of this world to live righteously and godly. So he is saying to the completed church, to the church who is going through the fiery trials, grace be unto you and peace from him which is and which was and which is to come, and from the 7 spirits which are before his throne. Now, we're looking at the 2nd and the 3rd chapter of Revelation, because the 2nd and 3rd chapter is about the 7 churches. 7 churches. And in these chapters, you've got little small short epistles, or little short books, instructions to each one of the churches. And we see these churches here are represented. Let me read it one more time. He says in verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet. He didn't say I heard a trumpet. He said I heard a trumpet sounding voice saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. Now, let me say this once more. They worshipped all kinds of gods. Asia Minor was the western part of Turkey, not Pakistan and China and Laos and Cambodia, in Korea and Japan. That wasn't Asia, not Malaysia. Asia was the western part of Turkey, and there were 7 churches right there together. And John was on the Isle of Patmos. It's one of these little islands right off the southeastern end of this Turkish peninsula, which was called Asia, and it's right there where there's a division between the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So John is right off the coast here, writing to these 7 churches, and all he has to do is get a courier that will take these letters out. I don't know how he did that, but a courier to take the letters, somebody in a boat to row to shore and take these letters to these churches. Of course, we see the churches here. He says, I heard a great voice behind me as of a trumpet saying, verse 11, I'm Alpha and Omega. Now, I started to say, this is where the Pergamum Empire was. This is where whenever Cyrus conquered Babylon, and he drove out the Babylonians, and the Chaldeans of Babylon, the Chaldeans were the magicians of Babylon. And the Chaldeans were driven out, and they found their seat up here in the Pergamum Empire, and we see this church at Pergamus. We see the church, and the fire worship was driven out of Babylon, found a place in Pergamus, and all of this area was saturated with idolatry. Well, when he said, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, that was an idiom that everyone in this area, everyone all over the world actually knew it. Because in each one of these pagan states, they would say that Zeus was Alpha and Omega, and he was the beginning and the end, that he was the head and the tail. This was common terminology among those people. When John is writing to the 7 churches of Asia, and they've already heard this about these pagan gods, Jesus was saying, everything that you hear these people say concerning the pagan gods, he said, that's me. It's not Zeus. It's not Jupiter. It's none of these fathers of the gods. He said, it's me, saying, I am Alpha and Omega. So he didn't write that down because he thought, I'll write something profound. He was getting a message to these people that the God you serve is not the beginning and the end. He is not the first and the last. I am the first and the last. I am the Alpha and Omega. And what thou seest, write in a book, and send it unto the 7 churches. I keep saying there were more than 7 churches in Asia. God picked out 7, I believe, because 7 is the number of divine refinement all through the Bible. 7 trumpets, 7 seals, 7 vials in this book. You've got 7s everywhere in it. You got the 7 angels, 7 spirits, 7 seals. You've got 7 all through the Old Testament. 7 times the Ark of the Covenant was sprinkled on the 10th day of the 7th month. The priests were purified in 7 days. They had 7 years you had to work for a bond slave to be released from your obligation. And all through the Old Testament, I went through 7s when I first started this series. Then he says, what thou seest, write in a book and send unto the 7 churches which are in Asia. Here are the 7 churches. And these 7 churches are found, and each one of them has something wrong with them. When Paul writes to churches, John is writing in the 2nd and in the 3rd chapter of Revelation in a very short period, in a short order. He is doing the same thing that Paul did when he wrote to Rome, to the Romans, to the Galatians, to the Corinthians, to the Ephesians, the Philippians, to the Colossians. When he wrote to those people, John is doing this, except he's using shorter letters, and they're letters of correction. He says to the church at Ephesus, and we covered some of the church of Ephesus last week, and unto Smyrna, and unto Pergamus. We got much to say about Pergamus. This is the 3rd church in this line, because the Pergamum Empire, that is where, as I said, when Cyrus went in to the Babylon was sitting here right on the Euphrates River, about 150 miles or so north of the Persian Gulf. The ruins of Nimrod or the Babel Towers were found here on the Euphrates River. And when Babylon was straddling the river and had these huge 400-foot walls, nearly 400-foot deep moats, and they had the Euphrates River running around Babylon. Can you picture that? I mean, look at it from the top. If you had a bird's eye view of Babylon, here comes the Euphrates River from the north, and you've got this city like so, straddling the river, and then you had the river was running around Babylon, and they had these real deep moats, and with this raging river running down, they had drawbridges going over, but you could not ford this river going around Babylon. And of course, they had what you called one of the seven ancient wonders of the ancient world, and that was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They were supposed to be magnificent. Well, why wouldn't they have, from north to south, you got a river running right through this, and they could direct all these little tributaries off of this in their gardens and keep them watered around the clock every day. And they had all kinds of tropical plants and hanging gardens, and it was this beautiful thing. And they said, since we're surrounded by water and our walls, Babylon was 14 by 14. And here you'd come out across the desert and you'd see this magnificent 14-mile long. If you went on the other side, it's 14 miles. And of course they had one flaw. They said they couldn't be conquered. They had one flaw. They had a flaw because they said no one can conquer us. And Cyrus said, I'll conquer you. So he put a dam up on the river and ran the river out into the desert, into this desert here. And how much water can you run out there? You can run that for a long time. And he ran it into a big basin or a riverbed out there. And the river dried up, and they had big 2-leaf gates where they would walk down to the river, and some of the women washed their clothes. Well, Cyrus blocked up the Euphrates. He took his army and marched them down this river, came up to these 2-leaf gates, and inside the Babylonian walls, when he came down and did that, these 2-leaf gates had been left open because they didn't see any need in shutting them, because nobody can get to them through this river. It never occurred to them that he would block up the Euphrates and run it out in the desert and walk down the riverbed and come up to those 2-leaf gates, and the Bible tells us about that. And he comes in here, and when we look there in the 5th chapter of Daniel, is it 5th chapter or 6th? Sometimes I get confused on that. Look at that, Daniel. Okay, the 5th chapter. The 5th chapter of Daniel, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. And Belshazzar was partying, and Belshazzar was a representative of this sun worship of the ancient world. And he was partying with the instruments of the house of God. And this is the night that he saw the handwriting on the wall. When you look over here in the 24th verse, then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written, and this is the writing that was written, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, we know what that is, a numberer, because Mene was one of the titles for Allah, who was the Lord Moon, and the moon numbered the seasons. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Cyrus is at the door. Now, I'm telling you this for a reason. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balance and art found wanting. Paris, thy kingdom is divided and given unto the Medes and the Persians. This night, Cyrus is here. And of course, this was in 539 BC when Cyrus overthrew them. And then in 538 BC is when he gave the first decree for Judah to go back and rebuild the temple, because the Babylonians had carried him away into captivity in 586 BC. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with the scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him, because when Belshazzar had this dream and he saw this handwriting, he got Daniel in to interpret it, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, this seems to be a discrepancy, but Cyrus is the one that took the kingdom, and Darius was, sometimes they would come up and put a king's name in there. It depended on which chronicle they were looking at. They would put a king. It doesn't mean Darius was the one that overthrew Babylon. It merely means he was in the lineage here. When you get into some of the lineages and some of the chronologies of the Old Testament, the reason probably that they put Darius here instead of Cyrus is because the next chapter is talking about Darius being tricked to put Daniel into the lion's den. It doesn't mean that, and remember, chapter 6 is not in there. Chapter 6 is not inspired. So verse 31 is going with verse 1 of the following chapter. Now, this is the night that Darius comes in, and Cyrus comes in and takes over Babylon. And one of the first things he does, he throws out the Chaldean magicians. They have to have a place to go, and they find their place in the Pergamum Empire, where that Asclepius, the serpent god, is worshipped up here in Pergamus. So when we get to the third church in Revelation, the second chapter, the third church that discussed is the church of Pergamus. But let's get back to this. For some reason I got off on that, but at least you'll be prepared for this when we get to the Pergamus church. Pergamus was the very seat of all the fire worship of Babylon. You can trace, I've said this before, when the king of Tyre, the prince of Tyre, is equated with Satan, that was the father of Jezebel. Jezebel married Ahab in northern Israel, and he brought this Hercules Venus worship. That's what we call Lebanon now. There's Beirut. And that was the old Phoenician, or the system, the Sidonian and the Tyrian Empire. And Ethbaal, the father of Jezebel, was a priest of Ashtaroth and a priest of Baal of the Babylonian system. This is how you trace from Israel. Baal was, when you look up Baal in your McClintock and Strong, it will tell you, or you look up Hercules in your McClintock and Strong, it will tell you this is the Tyrian, that Baal was the Tyrian Hercules. So, or they'll say Hercules was the Tyrian Baal. Baal was the generic name for Hercules, and the grove was a generic name for Venus. So what was brought down into Israel was Hercules and Venus worship in that 16th chapter of 1 Kings. Now, you can trace it up here to Tyre, and the fact that the prince of Tyre, or Ethbaal, the father of Jezebel, he was a priest of this Babylonian system, and some of the scholars say that he was a priest of Ashtaroth, the female deities, and a priest of Baal, the sun god, or the sun deities. This is the system when Cyrus came down, captured the city, and he threw out, it was Persian kings that gave all the decrees for Israel to go back. Southern Judah was carried captive in 586 BC, And this happening of overthrowing Babylon happened in 539 BC. And we know that Darius wasn't the monarch of, the reason we know when it says Darius here, Darius was not the monarch until 522 BC. That's quite a distance later. That's when Darius began to rule. So in 538, when the first decree to go back and rebuild the temple that had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar was given, it was given by Cyrus. And you find that in 2 Chronicles, the 36th chapter, those last few verses, and in Ezra, the first chapter, the first 4 verses, you'll find that Cyrus gives the first decree in 538. Now, the point I'm getting at is that that all these decrees that were given for Judah to go back, 3 of them were given for Judah to go back and rebuild the temple. One, of course, the first one was in 538 BC, and the second one was in 520, and that was given by Darius. That's why we know that when it says that Darius, the Mede took the kingdom, it doesn't mean he took the kingdom immediately that night. Darius didn't start ruling until 522 BC, so it couldn't. So the night that he was that Belshazzar was overthrown, it couldn't have been Darius that took the kingdom that night. It was Cyrus, and even Herodotus, the historian, tells us it was Cyrus. And Cyrus, and the Bible tells of that prophecy. In fact, go back over to Isaiah, the 44th chapter, Isaiah 44, and that's what this is about in Isaiah 44. Isaiah, you start teaching on this stuff and it takes you everywhere. Isaiah 44, this prophecy of Cyrus, this is predestination. Isaiah is writing these words around 712 BC. That's about when he's writing these words. Cyrus doesn't come along until 538 BC. You understand what I'm saying here? 174 years before Cyrus comes down, he's prophesied by name in this 44th chapter and 45th chapter of Isaiah. He's prophesied by name 174 years before his campaign to overthrow Babylon. How's that for the sovereignty of God? 174 years. We know he wasn't a teenager at this time, and then he was 200 years old when he takes Babylon. We know that's not true. Look here. Here's what the Bible has to say about him. Verse 24 of chapter 44, thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee from the womb. I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone, that spreadeth abroad the earth by himself, that frustrateth the tokens of liars, and maketh diviners mad, that turneth wise men backward, and maketh their knowledge foolish, that confirmeth the word of his servant, and performeth the counsel of his messengers, that saith to Jerusalem, thou shalt be inhabited. Now, why is Isaiah prophesying about this? Jerusalem hasn't fallen yet. Jerusalem is not without inhabitant when Isaiah is saying these words. He's talking about after they collapse and fall during the reign of Cyrus. Or during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And to the cities of Judah ye shall be built. He's saying the cities of Judah will be built, and they are not even destroyed at the time Isaiah is writing this. I will raise up the decayed places thereof, that saith to the deep, be dry, I will dry up the rivers. God put it in the mind of Cyrus to dry up the Euphrates. That saith of Cyrus 174 years before he is going to walk down that riverbed. That saith of Cyrus by name, he is my shepherd. How can Cyrus be the shepherd? Because he's going to come in here, liberate. He's going to destroy Babylon, and Babylon is controlling the Jews that have been taken out in Judah. And it is Cyrus that's going to start the decrees to deliver the Jews out of Babylon and send them back over to rebuild the temple and the city over the next 150 years. And it will be Persian kings only. Well, Persian and Mede kings, it was a dual empire. It'll be the Persian and the Mede kings, no Babylonian kings, no Greek kings, no Roman kings, but they will still be part of the beast because they'll be ruling Israel. But all 4 decrees, the first decree by Cyrus in 538, the second decree by Darius in 520, the third decree in 457 by Artaxerxes. And all 3 of these decrees were concerning the rebuilding and supplying the temple with sacrifices and money and priesthood. And then the 4th decree will be in 444, and that will be Artaxerxes. And that will to be rebuild the city. And that decree will be given to Nehemiah. All right. But all of these are Persian kings. So when Cyrus destroys Babylon, well, let's look at the destruction. That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built into the temple, thy foundation shall be laid. But it won't be Cyrus that gives the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. It will be one of his descending heirs to this throne of Persia, which was the old Babylonian Empire. And the one who will be heir to the throne, Artaxerxes, he'll give that decree in 444 BC to rebuild the city, gives it to Nehemiah in the 2nd chapter of Nehemiah. Then he says in chapter 45, verse 1, thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden. The right hand was the hand of authority. And the right hand, to the old ancient world, most people being right-handed, that was considered the hand that they carried the sword in. To subdue nations before him, I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the 2-leaved gates. They had great, big, huge gates. When they went down to the river, they were great, big, tall, 20-foot gates, something like that, at 15, 18, 20 foot. And they left those gates open, and when Cyrus came down, he came in those 2-leaved gates, and he arrested all of the Babylonians, and that night, Belshazzar died. That's from the 5th chapter of Daniel. I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut asunder the bars of iron. I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel, for Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect. God caused Cyrus to do this, not just for the sake of destroying Babylon, but for the sake of Israel, because it was Babylon that was keeping Israel bound, and it's Cyrus that says, I'm going to give you decrees to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, and I'm going to allow you to go back to your own land. Of course, only about 50,000 people went back, and there were millions in the Babylonian Empire system, and most of them wanted to stay there, but that's why Cyrus is called the anointed of the Lord. He's called God's shepherd. For Jacob, my servant's sake, and Israel, mine elect, I have even called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. I am the Lord, and there's none else. There's no God beside me. I girded thee, Israel, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west. Israel is going to be scattered all over the earth. I am the Lord, and there is none else. And in reference to Cyrus coming in and pillaging and murdering and raping and doing all these things, his soldiers doing all these things to the Babylonians, that's what this verse is about. I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things when I bring all this evil on Babylon. And remember, God said when Babylon destroys, when the Persians destroy Babylon, he said, I will cause the Persian soldiers to come in and to ravish the women. That word ravish means to rape them. Boy, that sure is a mixture of our understanding. Cyrus is a shepherd of God. He's the anointed, and God's going to bring all this evil on Babylon so it can deliver Israel, and they refuse to go back. So he says, I'm going to measure out 70 weeks on you. And all of this is about Cyrus throughout this chapter. Gosh, I could read all of it, but I don't need to do that. Y'all can go home and read it. Now, while I'm reading this, I've readjusted my message. I'm going to cover Pergamus before I cover the rest of Ephesus, since I have set up for this. Let's go back over to Revelation. Back over to Revelation. You have to have this painted out for you. Now, we've already covered chapter 2. We've covered down to verse 5, but we haven't really covered it completely. I'll read verse 1 again of chapter 2 of Revelation. Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus. He's not talking about an angel, a guardian angel. The word angel, angelos, A-G-G-E-L-O-S, means a messenger. All of the pastors of the churches back then were called angel or angelos. It's the common word for messenger. Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write, these things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand. And of course, the last verse of chapter 1 says, the mystery of the 7 stars in the right hand of Christ, which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the messengers of the 7 churches. What if I said, the 7 stars in the right hand of Christ are the preachers of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. Now you got candlesticks, a Jewish candlestick or menorah being equated with a Gentile church. How can the church not be Jewish? It is. The New Testament is a Jewish book. Then, of course, he says, what I've got against the Ephesians in verse 4 is they left their first love. And that word love is agape. Agape. They've quit walking in the commandments of God the way they did when they first come to Christ. There's a lot of people who come to Grace and Truth Ministries. Boy, they're really raring to go, and they're ready to go. And boy, I really love this truth. And I love predestination. I love the truth about Christmas. And I really got a hold of this, and I'm really going good. And it's been 6 months. Now it's a year. Now I'm doing great. And I'm fighting my mother, and I'm fighting my father about Christmas. And they're after me, and I quit talking to them. And I quit talking to them about predestination. I think I'll quit. They leave their first love. They walk away. And they look for an easier gospel. They look for somebody to preach to them good words and fair speeches. And by these, they're deceived because they're simple. They're very simple-minded, and they haven't matured in the truth yet. Now, the second church is Smyrna, but I'm going to come back to that. We'll just look at the beginning of it. Verse 8, unto the angel of the church in Smyrna. This word Smyrna comes from the word M-Y-R-R-H, myrrh. Myrrh was something they used. It was a sweet-smelling fragrance. And they didn't actually embalm people back then. The day that they died among the Jews, they took them immediately and put them in a tomb. Boom. Funerals that we celebrate today, funerals are of pagan origin. It was a party that they would have, and that's what it is today. You go to the funeral home, everybody goes in the back room, somebody brings lots of food, and everybody eats while that dead corpse lays out there. That's what it is. It's a party. That was pagan in origin. Now, I like doing funerals because I've got a predestination funeral. I like that. And people that come, I tell them, well, everybody's got an appointment in a box like this one day, and you can't die 1 minute, 1 second before that time or 1 second after that time. God's appointed an exact time when you'll die. Now, look here he's talking about Smyrna here. And myrrh was used. It was a fragrant perfume. In fact, before they embalmed people and took all the blood out, the people would just lay there and rigor mortis would set in. They'd get stiff, and then they would start rotting and they would start stinking. The reason they began to send flowers to funerals was to cover up the smell of the rotting flesh. That's what flowers at funerals were for. It's not like, oh, you're dead, here's a flower. Oh, gosh, that makes me feel good. That wasn't what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to kill off the smell. And, in fact, when Pope John Paul II died, he said, the Roman Catholic Church says, if you're embalmed, you cannot be canonized and go into sainthood. And, of course, he said that he did not want to be embalmed, so they didn't embalm him. And one of the reporters got on there when he was, after he dead, about 3 or 4 days. He said he's beginning to stink. And it was getting real rank when you were up close to where he was because his body was rotting. And the embalming fluid keeps you from smelling it. Well, that's what the myrrh was. When Jesus was brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, frankincense was given to offer sacrifices and the prayers of the saints, or the altar of incense. And incense was put on everything. It was a white, grainy powder. It had a very sweet fragrance. So these were offerings to a king. Gold was a picture of purity, and myrrh was what they would put on the dead body to kill some of the smell. So Smyrna, it is a derivative of the word myrrh. It's the word muron. M-U-R-O-N is the word Smyrna. M-U-R-O-N. Muron. And then I'm going to read through this about Smyrna and then come back to it and go ahead and read into. There's some things I got to get into the Nicolaitans of chapter 6. We can probably cover that also in verse 6. We can also cover that in verse 15 of the church of Pergamus. Now, let's just read this. I'm going to read down to Pergamus. I'll come back and finish up Ephesus and finish up Smyrna next week. But since I've already painted this picture for you, how much time do I have, Mike? 39. Okay. I got some time where I can cover this. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last. Remember, that was a term given to the fathers of these gods in this area, which was dead and is alive. That's Christ, isn't it? He was raised from the dead. I know thy works in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. I'll cover that next week. I want to get to Pergamus tonight. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. I'm going to go into all this next week. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. And I'm going to go into the crown of life next week also. He that hath an ear, isn't that amazing? Let him hear. Let him hear is third person singular. And hear is an imperative mood. That is a command. And who is going to have an ear to hear? The elect, the hearing ear. And the seeing eye, the Lord hath made even both of them. Every time you see these words, he that hath an ear to hear, it's because God has given a man an ear to hear or understand the truth. That word hear means to understand and be obedient to. It has the idea of obedience, understanding and obeying. He that hath an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches, or unto the refined church. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death, and we'll go into that more next week. And to the angel of the church in Pergamus write. This is a real serious church, because Pergamus, when Cyrus drove out the Chaldeans, he drove them out, and they found their home in Pergamus. Very serious. It was this system. This, in Pergamus, this was the very seat of, let me erase this. Pergamus was the very seat of the worship of Aescupus. I believe that's the way you spell it. If it's not, I'll correct it. Aesculapius was the serpent god, or a fiery serpent. It was a convolution of the fiery serpents of in the wilderness. It's a convolution. And all of this, when they worshipped Apollyon. We get the word Apollos from that. Apollos, those people name their children pagan names. Apollos was a good man of God. He was a preacher of the truth. But this word Apollyon, he was the angel over these. He was the father of these scorpions. The scorpions in Revelation, the 9th chapter, and the scorpions are false teachers. And it comes from the word Apollumi, Apollomy, and that is the word perish or lost. The Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost. Those that are perishing, when the Bible speaks of someone being lost, that's the word. It's also a word. It's also the word destruction. Now, To the angel of the church of Pergamus write, these things saith he which hath the sharp sword with two edges. Well, Jesus said he's the one that has got the sharp sword from chapter 1, verse 16. He had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp two-edged sword. And we find that two-edged sword coming out of the mouth of Christ in the 19th chapter of Revelation. The 19th chapter, verse 11, I saw heaven open, behold a white horse. This is Christ coming back when he splits the heavens. The time factor of this is the same time factor of Matthew 24 and verse 27, as the lightning shines from the east to the west. That's the time factor of this. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. And I saw heaven open, and behold a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns, and he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he'll rule them with a rod of iron, and he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of God. That's the same winepress, the last few verses of the 14th chapter of Revelation. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And out of his mouth goes the sharp sword. And we know what that sharp sword is, according to Hebrews, the 4th chapter. Oops, that's not Hebrews. Hebrews, the 4th chapter there, and verse 12, for the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder soul and spirit and joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Now, let's go back over here to verse 13. We're talking about Pergamus. Pergamus is the seat of all the fire worship when it was driven out of Babylon. Now, whenever we preach that the fire worship was the Christ Mass that Constantine brought in the church, you can trace from Israel the tree worship, or Hercules, or the grove worship, the Venus worship. You can trace it up to Phoenicia. I'm pointing at Lebanon because that's the same thing. In fact, the word Lebanah is the word moon, one of the words for moon in the Hebrew scriptures, and they were moon worshipers, and the chief deity was the female deity. She was always represented as a tree, and they were all connected with the moon. So when we see Lebanon there, that word Lebanon comes from the word moon. And that was the land of Tyre in Sidon, or the old land of Phoenicia. Now, so whenever you can trace the grove and Baal up to Tyre, and you can trace it down here by mere fact that Ethbaal was the priest of this Babylonian system. And you can trace it from Babylon up to Pergamus, because that's where the Chaldeans were driven. They were driven out of here. The magicians found a seat up here, and this fire worship of here was spawned out of Babylon, and that was the seed of Asclepius, the serpent god. And the first knowledge of rays behind the heads of a deity was that serpent. They always draw it in the form of a cobra, And behind the heads of that were the sun rays. And when Constantine brought this fire worship into the Roman Catholic Church, when he brought it in, he took the old, this was long before Christ. He took the sun rays, put them, or sunburst, and have the head of a saint here, and are supposedly saints, because all they did was change the names. When they brought this fire worship in the church, they just changed the name of the statues and the grottos and the niches around Rome, and they put the sun god behind the heads of the saints, either in the form of the sunburst or in the form of the halo. That way, the Roman Catholics said that if they would amalgamate the two systems, that whenever the sun worshipers saw the halo, sometimes it was in the form of the nimbus, and the nimbus like so. And that's what we call an iron cross. And the iron cross was just a form of the swastika, is what it was. It was just a variation of the swastika. I'm not going to go into that. I got all kinds of pictures of the swastika and their variables. But they thought if we can put the sun in the same picture with the saint, then the Christians will be able to accept the sun god, and the sun god worshipers will be able to accept the Christians, and they can tolerate one another and hold hands. And that's what's going on in the world today. Well, let's hold hands with the Muslims. After all, they have a right to their beliefs. And you're a Baptist, and you have a right to your belief. And you're a Catholic, and he's a Mormon. And let's just all hold hands and go to heaven together. That is what Constantine did when he reached back to this system of Pergamus. And let's continue reading here. And I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. Now I'm going to put this up on the board because we're going to cover this. Satan's seat. Satan's seat. Now, in the ancient world, the Pontifex Maximus, God had a high priest in the ancient world. And the exact opposite to that priesthood, exact opposite was Pontifex Maximus. That means maximum priesthood or high priest. Pontifex Maximus was here in the old pagan Roman Empire when this system moved finally from Pergamus to Rome. We can actually trace from the Pergamum Empire when Attalus III died. He was the king of the Pergamum Empire and all of this fire worship. The Romans liked this. When they moved from down here, they moved to the Etruria, Etruria. Etruria is a city up here in the Pergamum Empire, and they called themselves Etruscans. And the Roman Empire loved the magic, the soothsaying. In fact, the word magic, the word magos or magi, these were the wise men from Babylon, evidently some believing wise men who had studied the stars. And the word magic means science of the magi. Science of the Magi. Well, who is not intrigued with all this magic? Isn't that the biggest act in Hollywood, in Vegas, for years, the last 10 or 15 years, has been those two, what's their names? Siegfried and Roy, yeah. Siegfried and Roy. And don't we like to see David Copperfield make buildings disappear and make elephants and trains disappear? That's intriguing. Well, Rome was in love with this magic. The only thing is, they had mastered sleight of hand. They were doing all kinds of magician's tricks. And they were saying that that they were gods or deities. And that's why they could do this. They weren't saying it was sleight of hand and that it was magic and it was for your entertainment. They were calling themselves gods. They just learned how to do it, and they learned how to con people. And that's what's going on in the world today. People are being conned by all this false doctrine. Now, we're going to talk about the seat of Satan, Satan's seat. Cyrus goes in, takes over, he drives it out, and the seat goes to Pergamus. Let's read the rest of this. And thou holdest fast my name, and hast not denied my faith, even in those days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr. Evidently there was a man there named Antipas, which laid his life down for the truth. And that's not going to be hard to lay your life down when you're in a church in Asia, and outside where you're meeting, every kind of pagan, idolatrous worship, all kinds of lascivious, debaucherous, concupiscence acts going on. I mean, the whole city is immersed in idolatry. Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you, where Satan dwelleth. What he's talking about, Pergamus was specifically a place. It was where Satan in the sense of the fire worship, Satan dwelleth. That's the fire worship. It's Satan because all the fire worship traces back to Babylon. And Babylon's beginning was at Babel in Genesis 11. And this is where the fire worship began. Fire worship. And it was actually the man that began the Babel Tower was Nimrod building it. And Nimrod was deified as Hercules or Orion or Mithra or whatever generic name you wanted to put on him. Of course, Mithra's birthday was December the 25th. And the Babel system started here, the fire worship or the tree worship. And it was Nimrod and his mother, Semiramis. And there was more emphasis put on the female deity than on the male deity of the ancient world. And always the female deity was represented as the mother with the child, the babe in arms. And she was called in many of these systems Madonna, which means Our Lady the Ruler. That's the title of Mary of Roman Catholicism, isn't it? Now, Gerald recognizes a lot of this because he was raised a Roman Catholic. That's the Mary of Romanism. In fact, when you go to the Cantonese in China, they had a female deity they called Kuan Yin, and she was called the Madonna of the Cantonese. So if you go into Canton, China, you have to stipulate, if you say Madonna, which Madonna you are talking about. If you're talking about Kuan Yin, or if you're talking about the Mary of Roman Catholicism. I believe that's the way her name is spelled. Now, I want to read something to you out of about the seat of Satan, out of the two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. This has more information than any book that I have ever read on any given subject. When you read it, this is where I've got one up here. What do I do with it? Does anybody see my old beat up? Oh, there it is. I wore this out. He had 265 historians out of antiquity. And when you use this, go back to the back. This is not falling apart. Go back to the back and look at your index. And you can find these various things in your index. One page has got so much information, it is real hard reading because you'll read 25 or 30 intricate facts off of one page. You're going, I can't remember all this. And the best way to study it and to read it, he had 265 different, historians that we probably can't even get to anymore. Let me see if I can read some of his bibliography. Yeah, here. Adams' Roman Antiquities, 1835. Alani Historia, Rome, 1545. Here's 1557, 1552, 1681. He's got a lot out of the 1800s. 1705, 1600, 1722, 1602, 1661, 1807. He goes back to the 1500s to some of these historians. I wish I had these books. He's got 265 of them he's given. So whenever you read the two Babylons, look at it's got more information for that size of book than any book you've never heard me say this, than any book I have ever seen or read from. More information on sun worship. And he studied this thing, something else. Now, talking about Satan's seat being at Pergamus, let me read to you here. First of all, he says, Peter's keys have now been restored to their rightful owner. Peter's chair must also go along with him. That far-famed chair came from the very quarter as the cross keys. He's talking about the keys belonging to the cardinals. Jesus said he held the keys of death and hell. Well, they say that Peter held these, but these were the keys of the old Babylonian Pontifex Maximus system. And the word cardinal comes from the word cardo, which means hinge. And they said among the old ancient pagans that they held the keys to the underworld. The very same reason that led the Pope to assume the Chaldean keys, Chaldean was the magicians of Babylon, naturally led him also to take possession of the vacant chair of the pagan Pontifex Maximus. As the Pontifex, by virtue of his office, had been the hierophant or the interpreter of the mysteries, his chair of office was as well entitled to be called Peter's chair as the pagan keys to be called the keys of Peter. And so it was accordingly. The real pedigree of the far-famed chair of Peter will appear from the following facts. The Romans had, says Bauer, as they thought, till the year 1662, a pregnant proof not only of Peter's erecting their chair, but of his sitting in it himself. And may I stop to say this. when Mel Gibson put out that movie, The Passion, he made the statement. First of all, he's an idiot. He made the statement, he said, I do not know a better Christian in the world than my wife. However, she's an Episcopalian. And he said, unless you're a Catholic, unless you're Roman Catholic, you partake of the Mass, then you're outside the church, you're a pagan. And he made this statement. He said, I drink, I carry on and carouse, and my wife's a better Christian than me. But he says, I am going to listen to the chair. That was his words. He knew what this chair was about. It's supposed to be the chair that the Pope sits in, but Mr. Hislop traces his back to the old pagan Pontifex Maximus of the fire worship. And he says he took the keys out of the ancient world from the fire worship. And when Jesus speaks, he has the keys to the kingdom. See, that's a convolution of that. And then let me read on. For till that year, the very chair on which they believed, or would make others believe, he had sat, was shown and exposed to public adoration on the 18th of January, the festival of the said chair. And this is the seed of Satan that we find here in Revelation, the second chapter there, speaking about this seed of Satan there in verse 13, where Satan's seed is. But while it was cleaning, in order to set it up in some conspicuous place of the Vatican, the 12 labors of Hercules unluckily appeared on it. It had it engraved around the chair, the 12 labors of Hercules. So they figured out that wasn't Peter's chair. And that's the one that Mel Stupid is listening to. I'm going to listen to this chair of Hercules. Mel Gibson's going to go to hell one day. And so had to be laid aside. The partisans of the papacy were not a little disconcerted by this discovery of the 12 labors of Hercules being engraven around the chair. But they tried to put the best face on the matter they could. Our worship, says Giacomo Bartolini in his Sacred Antiquities of Rome, while relating the circumstances of this discovery, our worship, however, was not misplaced, since it was not the wood we paid it, but to the prince of the apostles, St. Peter. Peter was not the first pope. When Jesus said, thou art Peter, and upon this rock, he said, thou art Petros, a little stone, and upon this mountain, Petra, big stone, I will build my church. And he said, I'm building my church on the statement you made, Peter. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Upon this rock, this statement. But the prince of the apostles, St. Peter, that had been supposed to have sat in it, whatever the reader may think of this apology for chair worship, he will surely at least perceive, taking this in connection with what we have already seen, that the hoary fable of Peter's chair, hoary means old or gray-haired, the hoary fable of Peter's chair is fairly exploded. In modern times, Rome seems to have been rather unfortunate in regard to Peter's chair. For even after that which bore the 12 labors of Hercules had been condemned and cast aside, they went out to find another of Peter's chairs. As unfit to bear the light of the Reformation had poured upon the darkness of the Holy See, that which was chosen to replace it was destined to reveal still more ludicrously the barefaced impostors of the papacy. The second chair they came up with and said was Peter's chair is worse than the first. The former chair was borrowed from the pagans. The next appears to have been purloined by the Mussulmans For when the French soldiers under General Bonaparte took possession of Rome in 1795, they found on the back of this new chair in Arabic this well-known sentence of the Koran: there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Now that's the chair. The Pope has not merely a chair to sit in, but he has a chair to be carried in pomp and state, and that's the way they were carried in the ancient world. That's the way the Pontifex Maximus was carried around.
They carried the Pope around today.
That's right. And you remember when they carried the Egyptian priests around like that, and the kings? The Pope has not merely a chair to sit in, but he has a chair to be carried in pomp and state on men's shoulders when he pays a visit to St. Peter's or any of the churches at Rome. Thus does an eyewitness describe such a pageant on the Lord's Day in the headquarters of the papal idolatry. The drums were heard beating without. The guns of the soldiers rung on the stone pavement of the house of God, as at the bidding of their officers they grounded, shouldered, and presented arms. How unlike the Sabbath, how unlike religion, how unlike the suitable preparation to receive a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. He's saying this is in exact opposition to the way Jesus should be received, meek and lowly, not in pomp and circumstance. Now moving slowly between the two armed lines of soldiers appeared a long procession of ecclesiastics, bishops, canons, cardinals, preceding the Roman pontiff, who was borne on a gilded chair, clad in vestments, resplendent as the sun. His bearers were 12 men clad in crimson, being immediately preceded by several persons carrying a cross. His mitre, his triple crown, and other insignia of his office, as he was borne along the shoulders of men amid the gaping crowds. His head was shaded or canopied by two immense fans made of peacock's feathers, which were borne by two attendants. And he's got a picture of here of how they carried the same thing among the old Egyptians. Among the fire worshippers of the ancient world. They were carried the same way. Now, let me finish this. Thus it is with sovereign pontiff of Rome at this day, only that frequently over and above being shaded by the fan, which is just the mystic fan of Bacchus. In the Bacchalalia, Bacchus was the god of wine and partying and debauchery and illicit sex and gaming, and his chair of state is also covered with a regular canopy. Now look back through the vista of 3,000 years and see how the sovereign pontiff of Egypt used to pay a visit to the temple of his god. Having reached the precincts of the temple, says Wilkinson, one of the ancient historians, the guards and royal attendants selected to be the representatives of the whole army entered the courts. Military bands played the favorite airs of the country and the numerous standards of different regiments, the banners floating on the wind, the bright luster of arms, the immense concourse of people, and the imposing majesty of lofty towers of Propylaea, decked with their bright-colored flags steaming above the cornice, presented a scene seldom, we may say, equaled on any occasion in any country. The most striking feature of this pompous ceremony was the brilliant cortege of the monarch, who was either borne in his chair of state by the principal officers of state under a rich canopy, or walked on foot, overshadowed with rich flabella and fans of waving plumes. We give as this woodcut from Wilkinson the central portion of one of his plates devoted to such an Egyptian procession, that the reader may see with his own eyes how exactly the pagan agrees with the well-known account of the papal ceremony. Now, let me just, do I have any time, Mike? 5 minutes. Let me just give you this real quick, if I can. I've got a section just on Asclepius. He was the serpent god at Pergamus. And behind his head were the sun rays. Asclepius was the child of the sun. To symbolize this relationship, the head of the image of Asclepius was generally encircled with rays. The Pope thus encircles the heads of the pretended images of Christ, but the real source of these irradiations is patent to all acquainted either with the literature or the art of Rome. The golden beams around the head of Asclepius were intended to mark the same, to point him out as the child of the sun, or the Son incarnate. The golden beams around the heads of the pictures and images called by the name of Christ were intended to show the pagans that they might safely worship them as the images of their well-known divinities, though called by different name. Now Asclepius, in a time of deadly pestilence, had been invited from the Epidaurus to Rome. When Attalus III died, he was the head of the Pergamum Empire, head of the magician worship, where Satan's seat is. And when he died, they moved the seat of Satan, or the seat of Hercules, or whatever god, whatever sun god. They moved that with a flaming torch, took it over to the Roman boot of Italy, and took it into the Roman temples of Mithra, whose birthday was December the 25th. And they lit the eternal flame of Mithra. And it was up to the Vestal Virgins, and he tells you that the Vestal Virgins that the nuns are traced back to the order of the Vestal Virgins, whose job it was to keep the flame burning, the eternal flame burning in the temple of Mithra. You can go to Italy, you can trace back to Pergamus, you can trace back to Babel, you can trace over here to Tyre and down to Israel. The same system that Israel was worshiping, called Baal in the Grove, you can trace it straight to the Roman system. And when one of these preachers like Jack Van Imp, tries to come up and say, oh, this is not the Christmas tree, it's exactly the Christmas tree in Jeremiah 10. Baal is the Tyrian Hercules. It is the system of Pergamus where Satan's seat is. Is there any wonder they had all kinds of error moving into their church? They were surrounded, not unlike us, with all kinds of paganism out here under a different name. They called these gods Father, and they called the sons Savior, and all the sons were virgin born, and they had a new birth in their paganism, and they called it being born again. And all those sons, the children of the sun, the sons of the sun gods like Hercules and Adonis, and their fathers were Jupiter and Zeus and the various fathers of the gods. We're still involved in Greek god worship in the world. Immersed in it, and it's nothing but self. When a man wants a god that he can serve comfortably, he builds him a god, puts his own laws in it, and he's actually serving self. So when we find Pergamus, you're going to have to go and do some research on Pergamus. I'll finish this up next week and go back to, I'm out of time, ain't I? 20 seconds. Oh, me. I'll come back next week. I'll finish up Pergamus, and I'll go into Attalus III. You can trace the system from Israel all the way to Rome. They actually took an Olympic torch. Olympic comes from Olympus. That was the mountain where all the gods lived. And they lit that torch in Pergamus from the fires in the temple of Asclepius and carried that torch over the Rome and lit those fires in the temple of Mithra. That was their chief fire god, his birthday being December the 25th. And then when one of the Caesars refused to wear the robes of the Pontifex Maximus, his name was Gratian, they outlawed that system. And then some years later, they re-implemented all that into the Roman Catholic Church. The Mass. Huh? No, it's not. Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer, and I'll getting through these chapter 2 and 3, you can see how easy it was for them to be apostate and to be fallen away. I don't feel like it's unlike us because there's so many people that come through here and fall away. And when we walk out that door and you're into free will, boom. You're into Christ's Mass. You're into Ishtar. You're into every ungodly doctrine out there. When you go to these Baptist churches, Church of Christ, Pentecostal churches, they're not any different than what was going on, that sun worship outside. It's all self-worship. They've invented a God with the same terminology in all these churches, and they don't want to do what this book says. Well, let's pray. Father, thank you for truth and for your word. God, I am so tired. Give me strength for the church. Sometimes I don't know what to ask you for. I just know that I want to stay here and preach this truth as long as I can. Be hated for it and be miserable in it. Be miserable around with these people around me, but be happy with your word. This is truly a wonderful, miserable doctrine you've given us. God, help us. Give us strength. Cause us to continue. Lord, I believe you've really called me to say truths that most men cannot handle. Lord, I'm willing to do it. Just keep me standing. In Jesus' name, amen.